Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Hannibal Part 13, Battle of Cannae Chapter 3 by HistoryMarche. So last time we got a good look at Varro and Paulus, the two consuls leading the Roman army, and we built up to the main engagement, which is what we'll be seeing today. The last couple of episodes have all been leading up to this part. I'm very excited to get into it. If you guys end up enjoying this episode, I would appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked in the description below, and will give you access to exclusive content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
Hey guys, the Battle of Cannae has 3 chapters. If you missed the previous one, you can find it here.
Hey, same thing. We've done reactions to all parts of HistoryMarche's Hannibal series, including Cannae chapters 1 and 2, so make sure to watch those before you watch this one. Alright, back to where we left off. We're getting close to this main engagement. Hannibal's baiting the Romans in. We'll see what happens.
On a sweltering August 2nd, the battle standard in front of Varro's tent signaled to the troops to array for battle.
And, you know, we talked about this whole thing last time. I don't want to get into it too much, at least not yet. There's this idea that Paulus was the cautious one, and Varro sort of irresponsibly brought the Romans into battle, but we saw last time why that might not be entirely true. We might be putting too much blame on Varro. There's also a good chance that at a certain point, the consuls might have been moving in the same direction. So, once again, that's what we talked about in the last part, and this is where we're starting from.
As the gusts of southwesterly Volturnus wind raised clouds of fine dust across the dry Apulian soil, for the next several hours, army officers closely supervised the complex deployment to ensure that the legions would form in the correct order. Varro and the rest of the Roman leadership decided to show the enemy their willingness to fight. However, they had no way of knowing if the Carthaginians would accept a battle in this new location. But then, Hannibal led his troops through the gates. And as a fan of our channel, you should definitely check out our friends over at CuriosityStream, my personal favorite streaming service that features...
Yes, y'all should do that. I have this video linked in the description below. Go check it out. Go leave HistoryMarche a like. Go check out their sponsor. Basically, show them support for making these fantastic videos. They deserve it.
And register with the code HistoryMarche to get 30 days of free, unlimited access to thousands of documentaries on CuriosityStream.
Nice.
And
go
by
do that.
registering, you'll also be supporting our channel.
So, we see both armies beginning to approach each other. A bit of a different engagement than we've seen up until this point. At least from this perspective, it might seem like, alright, the Romans and Hannibal are engaging on equal terms. They're both going forward. Of course, there's already been a little bit of interaction up until this point. Though, if we look at all the previous battles we've seen, a lot of them have included Hannibal baiting the Romans inwards and catching them in a trap. Of course, that is what the Romans want to avoid this time. The question is, can they avoid a similar fate that several other Roman armies have already met?
The two armies crossed the river Aufidius at various points and marched onto the dust-blown flat plain below the town of Cannae. Yet the Romans still weren't sure that Hannibal would give battle, so they left a 10,000-strong garrison in the main camp. It was Paulus who insisted on this, arguing that besides guarding the baggage, this force could also threaten Hannibal's camp and cut off his line of retreat once the battle went in favor of the Romans.
And I think that's not a bad idea. Once again, we see this breakdown between Paulus and Varro. We're not entirely sure what the truth is, but even though our sources are very biased, we probably can make the assumption that Paulus was more cautious than Varro, though it has surely been over-exaggerated.
However, Hannibal wasted no time in deploying his army, sending out his light troops to form a protective screen for the main body. Varro too sent out the Velites to mask the process of deployment from the enemy.
Right.
There are suggestions that the Roman leadership didn't actually expect the more mobile Carthaginians to fight on such a narrow and confined battlefield, and merely wanted to deploy the legions in front of the enemy to boost morale and rebuild their confidence.
And you can understand that line of thinking, as we've seen up until this point. Though both sides rely on infantry and cavalry, the Carthaginians have always leaned more towards cavalry. They have some really strong cavalrymen from North Africa, from Iberia, and the Romans have always leaned more towards infantry. I mean, they have one of, if not the, best trained infantry force in the world at the moment, the Roman legionaries. So, the Romans would be more focused on their infantry, and if they can face the Carthaginians in such an enclosed space, they would probably imagine that they would have an advantage because the Carthaginian cavalry will be restricted. So that sort of reasoning makes sense.
After being humiliated the day before for refusing to fight. Such practices of building up the confidence of the men were common in the battles of this period, but it is far more probable that the Romans did, in fact, fully intend to fight this battle on the ground of their own choosing.
Yeah, and I would imagine that would be the case, because think of what we've seen up until this point. This is an absolutely gigantic mobilization of men on the Roman side. Rome has gathered this monstrous army. It's taken a lot of effort to mobilize all these troops, supply, get all the resources they need, and the Romans have, for once, been pretty careful in not engaging Hannibal up until this point. So it seems to me that if they've gotten this close and they're getting prepared for this battle, that they must actually understand and expect a real engagement. That's what I would think. Of course, we don't truly know, it's all speculation, but that's what I speculate.
Whatever the case, Hannibal is said to have had 40,000 infantry and 10,000 horse, while the Romans fielded around 70,000 infantry and 6,400 cavalry.
Wow. So, I mean, Hannibal is badly outnumbered. He still actually has more cavalry, as is the Carthaginian way, but overall, he's badly outnumbered.
Varro placed a screen of around 15,000 Velites in front of the main line. 4,000 allied horse were positioned on the left under his direct command, while Paulus was in charge of the 2,400 Roman cavalry deployed on the right. To compensate for their numerical inferiority, the squadrons of horsemen were packed in a tighter formation, with no more than 1.5 meters between each rider.
Interesting. And I will also say, Hannibal is badly outnumbered, but his army, total 50,000, that's nothing to sneeze at. Also, if you look at the breakdown of his infantry, you'll see 8,000 Libyans, 3,000 Spanish soldiers, and at this point, 21,000 Gallic troops. Sort of an interesting thing to look at. Of course, the core of Hannibal's army has been North Africans and his troops from Iberia. If you look at the cavalry, his Numidian cavalry are some of the best in the world, and his Spanish cavalry have been loyally serving the whole time. But as time has gone on, a lot of his troops have frankly not made it, and he's needed to grow his army to fight the Romans. He's picked up a lot of Gallic troops, especially a lot of Gallic infantry.
Room to maneuver the horses wasn't necessary, as their role would be purely defensive, while the infantry drove the attack forward. Regular Roman infantry was mixed with the cavalry to give more stability to the static squadrons. Servilius commanded the 55,000 Roman legionaries and allied troops in the center, arrayed in a much deeper and more tightly packed triplex Achis. Varro used the overstrength maniples to add depth to the infantry formations.
Yeah, I mean, you can just see even from the visuals presented, compared to the Carthaginians, the Romans have a very tightly packed and deep formation of men. I mean, very many soldiers deep, tightly packed, compared to the Carthaginians, who, simply due to the fact that they have less soldiers, are much less tightly packed, much more spread out.
Furthermore, he reduced the gaps between the lines to bring the full weight of the legions to bear, aiming to overwhelm the enemy. He knew that at Trasimene, the Roman heavy infantry held off the Carthaginians for hours, inflicting significant losses, despite being in an unfavorable position. And the year prior to that at Trebia, the legions hacked their way through the Carthaginian center, getting the better of both the Gauls and several contingents of Libyans, Hannibal's best infantry.
Sure, but of course, at the end of those battles, the Romans lost pretty badly. So it is worth pinpointing what you've done well in the past, but you also need to remember what went wrong in the past.
It's worth noting that the tighter maniple formations restricted the tactical flexibility, but eased the coordination of the massive army, and, more importantly, the deeper formations possessed longer endurance in a direct confrontation.
Right, and so you can absolutely see the pros and cons. The Romans are going for a straight-up confrontation, and this is a good formation for that. Not to mention, with the amount of men they have, especially the amount of infantry, I mean, this is pretty unprecedented. The Romans don't usually deal with this many men, and so they want to make it a little easier to control. Now, the downside is that this is probably a pretty immobile army. It's going to be difficult to properly maneuver this many men, especially now that they're so packed in. So, once again, pros and cons. If I was the Romans, I would always be worried about Hannibal. He's shown he can be tricky. He's shown he can maneuver quickly. He's shown he always has troops hiding where you least expect them. So I would always be worried about what he's going to try and pull. But, as always, the Romans are more prepped for a straight-up, face-to-face confrontation.
Thus, the Roman leadership was confident that the legions can outmatch the enemy and crush Hannibal's center yet again. To achieve this, Varro chose the battlefield wisely. He packed the legions on a narrow front, with the river and the hills near Cannae protecting the flanks from envelopment. This would force the Carthaginian horsemen into a frontal charge, and the Roman cavalry was tasked with delaying long enough for the legions to finish the job.
Right, and so the Romans are preparing for this face-to-face confrontation, and Varro is hoping that this battlefield he has selected will force that face-to-face confrontation that the Romans are so well prepped for, and that they hope the Carthaginians just can't handle.
If they could break through the Punic center, it wouldn't matter if the weaker Roman horse lost a fight on the wings, because at that point the Carthaginian cavalry couldn't do much more than harass the large block of legions. The selection of the battleground...
Yeah, you see where they're coming from, but it is always dangerous to have that sort of risk to the wings of your army, you know? Sure, your center is so much stronger, but you do have to be careful if the enemy's wings can overwhelm yours. That can lead to a lot of problems.
That Cannae could allow the heavy infantry to smash their Punic enemy. We do not know if Varro alone planned this, or if he was assisted by Paulus, Servilius, and other members of the Roman leadership. The Roman plan was simple but efficient. Meanwhile, Hannibal placed around 6,000 Spanish skirmishers and up to 2,000 renowned Balearic slingers as a screening force in front of the army, instructing them to raise as much dust as possible to hide the disposition of the troops. Behind them formed the close order infantry, with 21,000 Gallic warriors making up the bulk of the main line.
Right.
3,000 veteran Spanish infantry were interspersed to strengthen the center.
As I mentioned, Hannibal's remaining veterans who have been with him the whole way.
Unlike at Trebia, where his main line collapsed because he amassed all of his infantry to try and match the Romans, and didn't keep any reserves for decisive action and to plug the gaps in the line. This time he positioned the 8,000 Libyans, his best, most disciplined men, in the rear, hiding them from view behind the formations in the front.
All right.
On the Punic right were 4,000 Numidian horsemen, commanded by Hanno, tasked with holding the flank, while on the opposite side, the Carthaginian general placed 2,000 Spanish and 4,000 Gallic cavalry, under the command of Hasdrubal, planning to overload the left flank in a direct attack on the Roman right, hoping to smash the enemy cavalry and threaten the legions from the rear.
Both sides have their plans. Hannibal is greatly outnumbered, but he has his own idea for how he's going to win this battle. He has some men basically in reserve, ready to push if he needs an advantage. I guess we'll see which strategy, the strategy of the Romans or the strategy of the Carthaginians, or in this case Hannibal and his family, which strategy will actually work out.
Neither side was intimidated by the other. Gallic and Spanish troops had the confidence of past victories against the legions, while the Romans trusted in their superior numbers, remembering that even in prior defeats, their heavy infantry often prevailed in hand-to-hand combat against the Punic troops.
This is true, and they keep reiterating this, that, the Roman infantry is stronger. They have prevailed in the past, even during Roman defeats. And this is true, but I really wouldn't put too much confidence in that fact, right? Sure, the Roman infantry is strong, and they've had the advantage in the past, but where has it gotten them? I'll tell you where it's gotten them. A series of humiliating defeats. So I don't know if that's something I would necessarily put my confidence in.
Then, around midday, like a lumbering beast, the Roman formation moved forward.
All right.
The Carthaginian cavalry on the left led the line, trotting at pace, while the light infantry of both armies moved ahead of the main lines to open the engagement. Now, hidden behind the dust raised by the screen of skirmishers, Hannibal made his move. Advancing with the main line to form a crescent formation that would bulge towards the enemy.
And everybody, keep an eye on this. This battle is famous for one particular reason, and Hannibal is already beginning his strategy, the strategy that's going to very successfully play out throughout this battle. So everyone, keep an eye on that Carthaginian line. The curve of that Carthaginian line, just keep an eye on it. See what's happening.
He understood that the Romans chose this narrow battlefield to deploy their army as a battering ram, and that his outnumbered infantry stood no chance of stopping the legions if they tried matching them man for man. Therefore, the bulged line was supposed to absorb the attack and then slowly retreat, to buy time until the cavalry attack on the left unfolded.
Yep, they're laying it out. So you can see, Hannibal has this bulged line, so his men in the middle are going to be the first ones to take the brunt of those Roman soldiers, the advancing Roman line. But if you'll notice, where are the bulk of Hannibal's soldiers stationed? His quote-unquote reserves. Are they stationed in the middle, behind the middle? No, they're at the flanks. So you can sort of already start to imagine what might happen as the Romans keep pushing Hannibal's line backwards, and that's what we're going to see play out.
Hannibal personally commanded the troops in the center with the help of his youngest brother Mago, for these troops would bear the brunt of the Roman assault, and it was vital that they held out as long as possible.
Absolutely. Now look, Hannibal expects this line to be pushed back, but it is absolutely crucial that his men at the center of his line hold out for as long as possible, and even more importantly, when they start backing up, they can't break and run. They can't fully retreat. They need to keep their cool, even when they're being pushed back, and that takes a lot of discipline, training, and bravery. Look, when you're in a line of men, you're so badly outnumbered and you begin getting pushed back, your human instincts are telling you to drop and run. They can't do that. They need to hold firm, even if they're, quote-unquote, losing the confrontation.
As the skirmishing between the light troops began in the middle of the field, Carthaginian riders on the left advanced full tilt towards the Roman citizen cavalry. With veteran officers leading the way, the Spanish and Gallic squadrons stayed compact, doubling up on and dispersing the first lines of Roman horsemen, quickly penetrating their formation. Some of the Roman riders dismounted to fight on foot, but the Carthaginians swarmed their positions, dragging their opponents from their seats. But despite outnumbering the Romans 3-1, the confined space largely negated the numerical advantage of the Punic riders.
Wow.
Hasdrubal did well to tightly control his men, managing to overwhelm the Romans in a brief, furious charge. The Roman cavalry couldn't cope, and most of them broke and fled, with the Carthaginians now in hot pursuit. Others huddled together to hold off the Punic onslaught for as long as possible.
And if you're one of those Roman riders, that is your job. Hold off the Carthaginians, hold off the Punic onslaught for as long as you can, because, first off, it's bad enough if you get chased off the battlefield, but if a bunch of those Carthaginian riders are left with no Roman cavalry to engage them, then that gives them the opportunity to wheel back around on the rest of the Roman forces. Absolutely terrible for the Romans.
Paulus himself escaped the carnage with his retinue and moved to rejoin the fighting in the center. Meanwhile, on the opposite flank, the Numidians pinned down the allied Italian cavalry with hit and run attacks, with neither side able to gain an advantage. In the center, after a long exchange of projectiles, the skirmishers retreated behind the close order infantry as the Roman legions closed in.
All right.
The massed ranks of legionaries must have been an intimidating sight, advancing slowly while clashing their weapons against the wooden shields, whilst the trumpeters added to the cacophony of noise.
Must have been absolutely terrifying, and this is why I emphasize, this is true for any troop in a situation like this, but for these Carthaginians, at this very moment, these primarily Gallic troops, they really need to keep their nerve. They need to stand strong.
As an almost solid mass of rank upon rank of armored legionaries clashed with the enemy, Hannibal's advanced center narrowed the width of the initial contact, reducing the deadly momentum of the Roman attack. The bare-chested Gauls hacking at the enemy with their long slashing swords, and the Spanish in their white tunics thrusting forward with their short blades, stood firm and held back the enemy for a time.
And like they said, the shape of Hannibal's formation meant that the Roman impact was initially narrowed. That has been one of the effects of Hannibal's formation. We've yet to see many of the effects, but we can already see, even with all the advantages the Romans hold, the numerical advantage especially, Hannibal is still in some ways setting the terms for the battle. The way he has arranged his troops is going to basically establish how this battle is going to go.
But as more Roman troops entered the fray, the weight of the legions drove back the mixed Punic formation. Roman velators supported the attack, while the Carthaginian light footmen were ordered to reinforce the flanks of the infantry.
Yep.
Hannibal and
reinforce the flanks of the infantry.
his officers barked orders at the men, telling them to stand off the Roman assault and slowly move back.
Yes, and this is what's happening. Like I said, they can't break and flee, even in defeat, even as they're being pushed back. They need to stand strong and keep slowly backing up. Takes an incredible amount of nerve not to break and run at that point. So we can see the Carthaginian center is being pushed in. Particularly, Hannibal is reinforcing his flanks. Let's see where that goes.
already overwhelmed by the wall of scutum shields pushing them back. Ordering the troops to retreat further in the face of the enemy was fraught with risks.
Oh yeah.
All it would take is a few men buckling under pressure to cause slight cracks in the line that could quickly break the formation and turn into a rout.
It's true, so
but
true.
The Carthaginian general and his Punic captains led from the front, fighting...
Yeah, this is absolutely credit to, one, the bravery and discipline of those men, and two, the leadership of Hannibal and his officer corps. They are there, leading from the front, encouraging the men. Absolute credit to Hannibal, his officers, and the troops themselves.
Alongside the troops in the first lines, encouraging the men to hold their nerve, carefully controlling their withdrawal. Hannibal knew that he had to stay in the fight and buy time until events elsewhere on the field unfolded.
Yeah, I mean, this is really an incredible amount of organization and management during a battle. We've talked about throughout this series how, especially at a time like this, it was difficult to organize a large amount of men. Hannibal is now dealing with an army that is tens of thousands of men strong, and he wants them to perform this pretty precise maneuver. It takes a lot, but so far, it's working. Now we can see, basically Hannibal's line has flattened out, but the center is weak and continues to back up, whereas his flanks are reinforced. We basically start to see that bulging line. It's starting to inverse at this point.
And for now, the line held. Close to the hills on the right, the light Numidian horsemen fought in small groups, throwing their javelins and rapidly retreating before the enemy could pin them down. However, their attacks caused very little damage, and Varro simply remained in place, making no effort to drive them back. The main role of the...
Maybe could have been a little more proactive there, Varro.
Roman cavalry was to prevent the enemy from flanking the infantry formation long enough until the main assault of the legions broke through the center. But on the other flank, the superior Carthaginian horse have by now decimated the Roman cavalry, completely routing them from the field. Next, Hasdrubal could move against the rear of the Roman center or help surround Varro's allied cavalry on the right. But first, he had to regroup and allow his men and horses time to rest, who were by now exhausted from pursuing the fleeing enemy cavalry. Back in the...
I mean, first off, this battle is a real lesson in, keep an eye on the location of your opponent. Even if you think your center is incredibly strong, you never want to get flanked or surrounded in any way. And also, the Carthaginians have, this incredibly strong cavalry. The Romans have the infantry advantage. But at the end of the day, even though the cavalry play an important role, the infantry really decide the outcome of this engagement.
Center, as the Carthaginian infantry fell back before them, the Romans pressed on, prodding and cutting through the retreating enemy line. Sword in hand, the centurions and tribunes shouted orders through the deafening noise of the screams and the clattering of weapons, urging the maniples to charge together, sending more and more men into the concaved Punic center, which seemed like it will soon break.
Exactly. Oh, God, this battle's so brilliant. As they said, the Punic line, the Carthaginian line, is concave at this point. It's inwards. And so the Romans, who, of course, they feel themselves beginning to win, they keep pushing the Carthaginians back. They send more and more men to attack the center of Hannibal's line. And it is true. If the center of Hannibal's line breaks, it's all over. But if the center of his line stays strong, holds up, which is what he's really encouraging them to do, then I'm sure you can see that gives Hannibal an opportunity on the flanks, which he's waiting for.
Conversely, Hannibal and Mago pushed the men to resist a while longer, trying to gain every precious second, hoping that the Spanish and Gallic cavalry will come to their aid. But as more and more legionaries were drawn inwards, the Roman breakthrough was inevitable, and the pressure on the center finally broke the Punic line.
Yep.
The Gauls and Spanish at first moved back facing the enemy, with flurries of fighting still occurring, but before long they turned and routed. With the enemy now on the run, Paulus and Servilius poured more men into the gap.
And to be fair, they're giving us a bit of a misdirect, but you can imagine at this point, you know, if you don't know what's happening, you might think, wow, this is looking really bad for the Carthaginians. The Romans have got this one. I mean, they are breaking through Hannibal's line. He's done for. I mean, what's he gonna do?
Refusing to give the Carthaginians any chance to rally and reform their lines. The overcrowded Roman center surged forward into the salient. Hannibal's infantry on either side of the gaping hole managed to maintain their lines, but were nevertheless forced to retreat in good order. Meanwhile, up the field, Hasdrubal had reformed his squadrons and charged at Varro's formation, realizing that he could not move against the legions in the center before the threat of Roman cavalry was removed. Until now, Varro successfully held the flank, but seeing the incoming Carthaginians, the consul knew that the Roman cavalry on the other wing must have routed, and he could not see what was going on in the center. Unsure if the day was lost, and facing annihilation himself against a force 3 times his own, Varro fled the field.
Wow.
The
Not great.
Numidians gave...
I mean, look, we've talked about how a lot of blame is put on Varro, and a lot of it may not be deserved, but that's not a great mark to add to your resume. You know what I mean? Probably a pretty terrible moment to flee from the field.
Chase, while Hasdrubal once again had to stop to rest and reform his cavalry, before he could turn them towards the rear of the Roman infantry. Back in the center, legionaries in their tens of thousands pressed forward to complete the rout of the enemy. As they advanced into the gap, the Maniples lost all cohesion, turning into a disorganized mob that rushed forward, with their officers barely able to control small groups of men in their own immediate vicinity. This mattered little, however, as the Romans could taste victory, having punched straight through the enemy's center.
Of course, of course.
Hannibal relied on trickery and ruse in his prior victories, but it now seemed that the clear field at Cannae offered no possibility for him to set up an ambush.
Oh, it seemed, but this is what I say about Hannibal. You cannot give that man a second to work something out. You cannot give him any space. It seems like there's no room for deception or trickery or traps here. It's a wide, well, actually, it's not. It's a narrow field. The concentrated Roman infantry have won the day. There's nothing Hannibal can do. I mean, what sort of trick can he pull here? Don't ask that question, because you know Hannibal's got something up his sleeve.
But, as the mass of Romans streamed forward, they found themselves between the columns of Libyan infantry that moved against the pursuing troops. Incredibly, the Carthaginian general outwitted the Romans yet again. By carefully masking the position of the Libyans behind his troops in the front, and using the clouds of dust raised by the fighting, Hannibal concealed his best infantry from the enemy on an open field, luring the greatest army Rome has ever assembled into an ambush set in plain view.
Can you believe it? This man had no cover, you know, nothing to hide behind, and he still manages to set an ambush. How does he do it?
Letting the legions outflank themselves.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. Letting the legions outflank themselves. Hannibal has so many fewer men, so what does he do? He allows the legionaries to push his center in, pour thousands and thousands of legionaries in, basically making them push the center of his line in and push themselves into a trap, unbeknownst to them. How does he do it? Hannibal just has this incredible skill to set these traps and then force or just trick the Romans to push themselves into whatever trap he has set. He baits them every time.
As the Libyans pressed the overextended and disorganized mass on both sides, the momentum of the Roman attack dissolved, and the troops...
Of course, and I mean, this is exactly what happens, right? The Romans are confident of their success. They pushed Hannibal's center in. The center of the Carthaginian line is breaking. And what happens when you have that feeling of victory? Your troops are swelling forward, discipline breaks down. Formation breaks down. You just have a mass of Roman soldiers just running forward. Well, if you end up in a trap, a lot of your discipline is now gone, and your response time is going to be much slower than it would have been previously.
No longer under anyone's control. Hannibal and Mago rallied most of the routing Gallic and Spanish troops, turning to rejoin the fighting, while on the opposite side of the field, Hasdrubal charged into the rear of the enemy infantry.
Just incredible leadership from Hannibal to be there the whole time, able to command his men. And we can see, they're doing a great job of depicting this visually. We've sort of zoomed in a little more than we do in most battles, which I think is absolutely appropriate. You can see the absolute mass of Roman soldiers compared to the Carthaginian soldiers, and yet what we're seeing right now is the Roman soldiers currently being surrounded by that numerically inferior Carthaginian force. Incredible.
As the compression of the legions began, the utter defeat of the Roman army was now inevitable.
Yep, they're
With
done.
the maniples hopelessly intermingled, they could no longer reform their lines.
No, discipline has broken amongst the Romans, not due to loss or fear, but due to perceived victory. Discipline and formation has broken down. A mass of Roman soldiers has charged forward, and they're now being squeezed on all sides by the Carthaginians. What are they going to do? Of course, they can fight as hard as they can. They can continue to resist, but they're screwed.
To make matters worse, Libyan troops looked similar to Roman legionaries, having been equipped with Roman armor, helmets, and shields that they stripped from the dead at Trebia, Trasimene, and Geronium. The legionaries felt they were no longer protected on the flanks, and with the enemy seemingly amongst them, their nervousness soon turned to panic.
And I should say, this is why the Battle of Cannae is so famous. It is because you have a numerically inferior force, a force of, frankly, far less men under Hannibal, who manages to nonetheless flank a numerically superior force, the Romans. That's why it's famous. His ability to flank this numerically superior force and utterly defeat them. That is why. That reason and the absolute scale of this battle is why it's been remembered and studied ever since it happened.
Hannibal turned the strength of the Roman infantry, their deep, overwhelming formation, against them.
Yeah.
As their ranks contracted under the pressure of multiple attacks, centurions and tribunes tried in vain to improvise, as movement became ever harder in the confined space.
Yeah, and I feel it's absolutely worth reiterating. This comes down to the incredible planning of Hannibal, but none of this works unless the Carthaginian troops are incredibly brave, disciplined, willing to keep their nerve, take a stand, even when being pushed back, even in retreat. This really takes an incredible force of soldiers and incredible leadership.
Paulus and Servilius fought heroically, leading a stiff resistance, but both were eventually cut down during the fighting. Small groups of legionaries tried forming rough formations, but most were too exhausted and stood no chance against the fresh Libyans, who were kept in reserve for most of the day.
Yeah.
Some of the Roman troops, weary and fatigued, simply gave up, no longer having the strength to raise their weapons. As the hours passed, the battle became a one-sided massacre.
Yeah.
The fighting went on until dark, but there was little to no tactical...
You can imagine, it just became an absolute slaughter at some point. And it's funny, Paulus and seems like mainly Varro chose this field of battle because they felt it was advantageous to them. There wasn't enough room for the Carthaginians to pull any of their tricks or the Carthaginian cavalry to be used to its fullest effectiveness. And so the Romans were able to take their massive infantry force and stack it several lines deep. But what Hannibal has done has basically looked at that situation, which the Romans felt was to their advantage, and used it to his advantage. He's managed to draw them in and then surround them, and the Romans couldn't necessarily utilize the full force of their men because their army was so many lines deep that they could only make contact with the Carthaginian line at a fairly narrow point. And Hannibal's been able to take advantage of that and completely surround them, and now it's just an absolute slaughter. The Romans have been badly, badly defeated.
Sophistication in this final stage of the battle, as the Carthaginians systematically slaughtered most of the trapped infantry.
Yeah.
In the end, widespread Roman resistance collapsed, and those who had any strength left in them managed to flee towards the Roman camps and the nearby towns. Hannibal had won an unbelievable victory.
Truly.
By sundown, some 50,000 Roman infantry and 2,700 cavalry.
Truly unbelievable. 50,000 infantry casualties from the Roman. That was the size of Hannibal's whole army. I mean, that's also one of the exceptional things about this battle. Not just how it went down, not just the enormity, but, the level of death and destruction that the Romans had to deal with because of this strategy Hannibal used. It just became an absolute killing field, and so the amount of casualties was exceptionally high, even for such a bad defeat.
Lay dead or dying on the field at Cannae. The gory sight gave pause even to the most hardened of observers, as nearly 3,000 tons of human flesh was left to rot in the August sun. The true fruits of Hannibal's tactical masterpiece.
I mean, just imagine the sight, imagine the smell, the stench of that many dead, dying, and decaying bodies must have been absolutely horrific.
But achieving this slaughter cost Hannibal dearly. 5,700 of his men fell, a high figure for a victorious army in ancient times, which is testament to the harsh fighting on the day. Although it is worth noting that the Carthaginians were significantly outnumbered until the very end of the battle, which also played a role in the relatively high casualties for Hannibal's army.
Yeah, I mean, look, this was a tough battle, and we saw how long the Carthaginian line had to hold, how badly outnumbered they were. A tough win, but nonetheless, an overwhelming victory.
Nevertheless, the Roman leadership was decimated.
Yeah.
Consul Paulus, Proconsul Servilius, and Marcus Minucius Rufus were killed in the battle, along with 80 senators, 2 quaestors, 29 out of 48 military tribunes, some 300 equestrians.
Yeah, and I think I made a comment about this in a previous episode about how, well, it would be really bad if you lost your worst victory when you had sent just not only a massive amount of soldiers, but a massive amount of military leaders and political officials along with that army. And that is exactly what happened at Cannae. This battle is remarkable for so many reasons. Like I said, the strategy of Hannibal, how massive the victory was, the number of Romans that died, also sort of, I guess you might say, the quality of Romans that died. There were so many leaders, political and military leaders, amongst that Roman army who didn't make it out.
With many others captured and enslaved. Never has there been a defeat that struck so hard at the very heart of Roman society. And as night fell on August 2nd, 216 BC, Rome's very future was left in doubt.
Yeah.
Credit goes to our awesome patrons who made...
Absolutely fantastic, fantastic video. And, I mean, it's truly remarkable that Rome actually managed to survive this. It is a testament to Roman power of will that this war we're talking about, the Romans eventually managed to win. I'll remind you of that. That's a crazy thing to think about after seeing such a devastating loss. But we've got a long way to go until then. This is the absolute bottom of the Roman experience. An absolutely dreadful, humiliating, and frankly, like traumatizing loss. I mean, this is traumatizing to the Roman psyche. Yeah. Incredible video about a truly remarkable battle of history, one that, like I said, is still talked about and studied to this day. I had a great time with this one. I hope you guys did. If you did, please leave a like on the video and subscribe. You can see all the other reactions we have in store. Of course, we will be continuing this series. Anyway, I hope you guys are having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.